Welcome to the Silver Screen Guide podcast, where we discuss films from every genre. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the podcast. You disobey me, you puppy! Today we are discussing The Road Warrior Mad Max 2. This is your co-host Corbin.
I'm Allen, and this is a very it's kind of an interesting title because it's Mad Max 2 for essentially the rest of the world aside from the US, which was called The Road Warrior, because I didn't think it would do very well in the box office, and then it did really well. So now it's kind of adopted both titles of Mad Max 2 and The Road Warrior, so whatever.
Oh yeah, it's confusing because I have never seen this movie before. I've never seen any of these Mad Max movies aside from Fury Road, which is the fourth one. That was my introduction to Mad Max. What a glorious introduction.
Yes.
But yeah, The Road Warrior, I was confused because when I initially was hearing, or just when I had heard in passing about these movies, I thought The Road Warrior was the first movie. I thought that's just what it was called, The Road Warrior. And then they thought, hey, he kind of had a cool name, like they called him Mad Max in it. So let's just call the rest of the series Mad Max and then subtitle it. But that's not correct at all.
Yeah, I always got Beyond Thunderdome and The Road Warrior mixed up in the timeline. Because I knew that the original Mad Max, which is called Mad Max, is the first one. And Mad Max Fury Road is the fourth one. But I was confused. I kept getting these two confused, Fury Road and Beyond Thunderdome, with where they place in terms of release date. I've got it figured out now, because now I know that there are two titles to The Road Warrior, of Mad Max 2 and The Road Warrior. So, whatever, I guess. I got it figured out now.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure in this movie, they really don't ever refer to him as Max or Mad Max. If they do, it's briefly. But I don't know why they would, because nobody would know his name unless he told them. And they might, but it just seemed really apparent to me that calling him Max wasn't obvious, at least. They do refer to him as the Road Warrior, I believe, in the beginning and end monologues, though. Yeah,
they do refer to Max as the Road Warrior, but yeah, aside from using his name Max, I don't think they ever really do, and if they do, it's very, very brief. So yeah, mostly I do know that in the trailers and stuff, and for a lot of the promotional material for the US, they kind of tried to hide away that it was Max, because they didn't really want to relate this as much to the original Mad Max. Which, of course, once you go in and watch the opening prologue, it's kind of given to you that this is a continuation if you've seen the original. But for at least the promotional material, they didn't explicitly say that this was a sequel to the original.
Right, and the reason, like Alan mentioned, was because apparently the first movie wasn't popular in North America, or at least it wasn't popular enough to try and market it as a sequel, because people would probably think, what? I don't even remember the first one. So they just called it The Road Warrior, but then they mashed the titles together and rearranged them, and it all got confusing. But it was successful, and successful enough to call the third one Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. And from what I understand, many consider this to be one of the greatest action films and sequels ever made.
Yeah, for a lot of lists, this is in their top blank, top 100, 99. It's up there for not only just one of the best action films, but also just straight up one of the best films ever made. Especially coming off of the original Mad Max. So yeah, this has got quite the reputation. And I've heard it from a lot of people that if it isn't Fury Road that's the best, it's this one. This one, by most standards, it's either this one or Fury Road that are considered the two that are the best that are in this quadrilogy, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me last time we talked. And if you haven't heard our first episode, listeners, go ahead and go back into the archives, or just look in the description below, and you'll find the link to our first review, so you'll be able to catch up. But that was interesting to me, and if you do check the IMDb scores, this is second highest in the ratings, whereas Fury Road is the highest rated Mad Max film.
Right. And, I mean, its success also kind of goes as far as having its own museum put up in the town that it was filmed in. Broken Hill, I think it's New Wales. No, it's like New South Wales is where this movie was filmed. And so, like, years after, I think it was like early 2000s, they erected this museum. I don't know if it's just for this movie. I'm sure it's for, like, all Mad Max movies in one. But yeah, after the release of Mad Max 2 and beyond, they eventually put up a museum in the town of Broken Hill. Oh. So that's kind of cool.
Wow, that is cool. Yeah, I did not know that. Something I did know that I was surprised to find out at least is one of the main antagonists in this film. His name is Wes. He kind of has the red in his hair, and his rear end is like hanging out of his leather chaps half the movie. That was really pleasant.
Yeah. Yep.
He's played by Vernon Wells, and we've actually reviewed Vernon Wells' performance before in the movie Commando. He plays Bennett, who is the main antagonist, the guy who is completely out of shape with the mustache.
Yeah.
And he has the knife. And he's got the funny hair and the earrings, and he looks really different. I was surprised to find that was him. Of course, he's younger in this movie and completely dressed up differently and different body build and everything. But I was like, oh, hey, we've seen him before. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure if that episode was ever made public, though. That was initially a paid episode, and it still might be. So, listeners, you probably have no idea what we thought of his performance in that. But
I was to say, that's been a while since we talked about that episode. That was in the early days of Silver Screen Guide. That was like our, like fourth podcast or something?
Yeah, that was a part of our first retrospective series. That was our kind of our bonus episode of our Rambo series. So listeners, if you do want to go pay for that episode, it's pretty cheap. It's like $1. Go ahead and pay for that, and you can hear what we think about that fun, cheesy 80s film, Commando. And also, I guess we should just say we're going to be coming back to our Rambo retrospective this year.
We are. They announced.
Rambo Last Blood will be out just a little bit after the summer is over, kind of, or maybe early fall.
Yeah, I think I read September. If I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken. We'll also have to talk about that title, though.
That's good.
Well, I mean, that is a few weeks away. But yes, Rainbow is returning, which is funny because it's our very first retrospective that we did, and now it's all coming full circle, I guess you could say.
Yep, just like in Rainbow 3, full circle. That's what they say in that movie. Go listen to the episode, and you'll know what we're talking about. But this movie, The Road Warrior, was perceived very well at the time. I was a little surprised to see Roger Ebert gave it 3.5 out of 4 stars because he just considered it such a really great, pure action movie. And I think that's what most people remember this movie for, is they perceive it as just this adrenaline rush of nonstop action. It's not really about the story or the characters per se. It's just about the intense car chases. It's amped up from the last movie.
Right. And it's kind of funny because after Mad Max was released and it went nuts in the box office, I think last time we talked about it, it made around 100 million or so. And I think the worldwide gross, which is a lot of money compared to the budget that it had. George Miller was actually approached by a lot of people to return to Hollywood and make a movie for Hollywood. One of them is First Blood. They wanted him to direct the movie First Blood. Which is funny because we were just talking about that. But he didn't really want to do any of that stuff, and eventually they did return to Mad Max, but they had a lot of pressure going into making a sequel because everyone wanted a sequel from them. And eventually, I'm not saying that they caved, but he was like, what would we do if we returned to Mad Max? And then that led down the road of crafting a script and all kinds of stuff, and now we're here. So it is kind of funny that he was approached by Hollywood for a lot of different projects, but most notably First Blood.
And were you talking about the first Mad Max grossing 100 million?
Yeah, like worldwide it grossed a ton of money. I want to say it was 100 million, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
Could that be upon re-releases though, not just initially?
It is possible.
I think that's probably it.
Yeah, it is possible that some of that is due to re-releases. Well, okay, domestically it made $8.7 million, almost 8.8 million. But that's just in the United States. That's all they have here. So it might be adjusted. Who knows? That's just what I read is 100 million. I think it was on Wikipedia or something that I got that number from.
Yeah, they could also be including home video releases for that number.
Right.
Because it was a fairly limited release in Australia, and then it was still fairly limited worldwide, right. I think. And ultimately, this one was a wider release, but still not a really wide release. I mean, maybe for the time it was pretty decent, but from what I saw, Warner Brothers did distribute it, and they've been distributing ever since.
Right, and there was kind of an interesting release with AIP because they were changing ownership from, I forget who they owned by previously, but they were changing over to Filmways Incorporated, and that kind of hurt the release of Mad Max 2, and upon all of this, it was changed to the Road Warrior for the U.S. Because it didn't do so hot, and so this also kind of hurt this release when it was coming out. Is Warner Bros. And AIP changing over from one to the other, from different changing owners and all kinds of stuff.
I did check opening weekend. It did come in fourth with 2.5 million, which is about half of its budget. Mm-hmm. And it was beat out by Conan the Barbarian, Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid. I've never heard of that. And Porky's.
I think I've heard of that.
I haven't heard of that, but I've heard of Porky's. I haven't seen it. I hear it's kind of raunchy, I think. Mm-hmm. But of course, Conan was the big kind of blockbuster of the time.
Oh, yeah. But I do know that it did end up doing pretty well in the U.S. I think its total gross, this is, well, it's kind of hard to say if this is worldwide, but its total gross was 23.6 million. I know that 11.3 million of that was from the U.S. and Canada. So,
right.
Still a good release, though. Oh, no, sorry.
That's a good release for...
Yeah, I got that wrong. It is 23.7 million for U.S. and Canada alone. And 10.8 million for Australia. There we go.
Yeah, so likely the worldwide gross is around 33 million. For a budget of 4.5 million, that's a pretty good take-in. Oh, yeah. So they made a good profit off of that, I would say.
Yeah, and that's not counting other parts of the world that this movie was released in. I don't know if they released those numbers anywhere to see what the actual worldwide gross is. This may be the actual worldwide gross, is how much it may be between Australia and the U.S.
That's my guess.
Kind of hard to say, but yeah.
That would be my guess. But before we jump into the plot, I want to give you a warning, listeners, that we will be spoiling Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. So if you haven't seen it before and you do want to see it, go ahead and click pause right now. Go watch the movie, come back and click play, and we'll be ready to talk about it.
Sometime after the events of its predecessor, Mad Max, our main lead, Max, now roams the desert with the same V8 pursuit vehicle that he left, that he stole from the previous movie. We don't really know how long it's been, but it sounds like it's been at least a few years since the events of the first one. He has a new partner now, which is a dog. Max, in the beginnings of the movie, Max comes across a seemingly abandoned gyrocopter and makes an attempt to steal its gasoline, but is jumped by a man and a snake. Max overpowers the captain, but spares his life when the gyro captain, which he will later be helmed as, informs Max of a community that has thousands upon thousands of gallons of gasoline. Now, it should be noted, in this world, gasoline is considered a very big commodity and is heavily sought after by many a folk. Max, and a sort of new comrade, gyro captain, hide away in a nearby hill and find that a gang, led by Lord Humongous, is attempting to steal the gasoline from the community. A couple from the settlement try to sneak out to find something to transport their tank of fuel elsewhere, but are intercepted by Lord Humongous's protege, Wes, and his crew. The woman is raped and left to die, while the man is left with little life in him. Max comes across him and helps him back to the complex as a means to get inside. Unfortunately, the man does not survive, and Max is chained to a post while the settlers decide what to do with the gasoline and with Max. Lord Humongous has given them 1 day to give them their fuel, or he will destroy the town and forcibly take it from them. Max breaks free from his cuffs, and strikes a deal with the settlers. He knows where he can get a semi to transport the fuel, but requires as much fuel as he can carry and his freedom in return. The settlers reluctantly agree and stock him full of gasoline while he walks his way back to the gyrocopter, meeting with his captain along the way and eventually coming across the semi he saw earlier. Max just makes it back in the main gate of the settlement after being attacked by Wes and his men. The settlers ask Max to drive the semi, but he refuses and requests his fuel to leave. He drives off, is followed by Wes. He is driven off the road and his pursuit vehicle is demolished. Max's dog is killed and his car self-destructs when one of Wes's men tries to siphon fuel from his tank. Luckily, the gyro captain saw the smoke from the explosion and rescues Max from death. Max agrees after returning to the settlement to drive the tanker, as he is the best driver that they have, despite his injuries. The settlement packs up and heads out. Humongous' gang chases after them, and a small posse heads back into the town, but are caught in its self-destruction. The semi flies through the desert, but is pursued by Humongous and friends, but eventually the semi is forced off the road and flips. It is revealed that the tanker they were hauling isn't filled with fuel at all, but sand. The real fuel is with the settlers, hidden away in their vehicles, who are miles away by this point. The gyro captain meets up with the settlers after being shot down, and becomes a new leader. The settlers head towards the coasts to start their new tribe, to be known as the Great North Tribe, as Max stays behind to roam the desert as credits roll.
Now, this is an interesting opening to the film where we have this old man narrating the history of how the world essentially fell into chaos and anarchy. The civil society was destroyed. And I understand that in the first movie, that's what they were alluding to, but it really didn't. It seemed like this kind of hybrid, civilized outlaw world, whereas this is just a completely brand new, savage, Old Testament style outlaw world with crazy turf wars and dictators and stuff. But we get this old man narrating the road warrior and this wasted land, a man who wandered out into the wasteland, which just so happens to be the supposed title to the sequel, Fury Road, Mad Max The Wasteland. So hopefully we'll get that someday, but we'll see. I just thought it was interesting. They used that quite a bit. But, and they also, very much thought of Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2 with this opening. Have you seen that one, Alan?
I haven't yet, and I need to, but I haven't.
Well, it's interesting because when you see it, you'll notice what I'm talking about, because Evil Dead 2 was in certain ways, at least the opening, a rebranding, kind of a reimagining of the first one.
Right.
It's kind of like, this is what I wish I could have done, or I had more ideas, let's beef it up and kind of like redo it this way. And Evil Dead 2 came out in 87. This came out in 81. So most likely Sam Raimi saw George Miller's version. He was like, I'm going to do that, because Evil Dead 2 opens with the narration, recounts the events of the first movie, retcons them just a bit, and then kind of gives you a brand new package that still feels familiar. So, and we do get reused footage from the first movie.
Yeah, we do. And this kind of just sets up that it is, in fact, a sequel from the first one. Things have changed, both in terms of filmmaking and also in terms of what kind of themes we're going to get ourselves into. And it is also interesting to note that gasoline, which we did kind of mention in the last podcast, but only very briefly because it was only kind of mentioned in the movie and one scene, gasoline has essentially become more like currency nowadays, where in order to get from one place to another, you need gasoline, right? And so now gasoline in this world has pretty much taken over everyone's lives. They need to have gasoline to survive, more or less, in this wasteland. So it's interesting to see how this fuel that came from the earth, they're essentially using it now as more like water than anything else.
Yeah, that is an interesting point to bring up, because in the old days, nomadic desert dwellers would need to go from like watering hole to watering hole to ensure their camels or horses had, hydration to move around. Well, that's pretty much obsolete in the 21st, well, even the 20th century with vehicles. So the black oil is what they call it here in the beginning, was this hot commodity that the world tore itself apart over. And now Max kind of comes in between this turf battle between the Humongous Clan and do we get a name for this little outpost here of people that wear white all the time, I guess?
I don't know if it's ever stated in the movie. I just called it the settlement in my notes. I didn't find any like name for it anywhere, so.
Yeah, everybody's name is really basic here. The warrior woman is, we'll talk about her later, feral kid, who is actually more important than we realize. Spoiler alert, he is the old man.
Yep he is.
He learns to speak really eloquently. That really threw me for a loop. But most importantly, we learn here in the opening, this wasteland was where Max learned to live again. Because I guess he was just a greedy oil person now and just was killing people. I guess he was just had more animalistic. He was just driven by the Nietzsche ethic, survival of the fittest. But now it's not really about that. We learned that through the movie.
Right. Yeah. And from the events of the last movie, we talked about how Max kind of walks away from Johnny the Boy and his execution. We don't know if Johnny Boy died, but it sure does insinuate that he did. The situation that he sets up, which we mostly talked about, and how Max kind of has fallen away from his police force mentality, where he wants to stay and keep order and all kinds of things like that. Now he's pretty much the complete opposite that he was from the beginning of the first one, and we do get to see throughout the events of this one how he kind of changes and becomes more like he was in the first Mad Max than from the beginning here. Because it is this journey to have more life. This is brought up in the very opening of the movie, where helping this civilization or helping this community or the settlement, he does get to more or less find his, I guess, humanity again to some extent by helping them out through the events of this one. So yeah, it is interesting that we start off with our main character just about the same as Toe Cutter and his gang, the way that they act, about the same as them in the opening of this one.
Oh, sorry, I was looking up something real quick. 77. Don't worry, this is important. Okay, good. That will make everything I say true. Okay. But as for the plot of this movie, how likely do you think George Miller watched Star Wars: A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back and picked some ideas from that? Because in many ways, Max is the Han Solo character. He doesn't really care about anybody. He's like, hey, princess, I'm just here for the gold. I'm here for the reward, which in this would be oil. But eventually he returns and helps them destroy the enemy. I just found a lot of parallels here between this and the first two Star Wars movies.
Oh yeah, I can see it now that you're mentioning it. I can see where some ideas of Han Solo were lifted for the character of Max. I mean, it's not like it doesn't make any sense, because even from the events of the last movie to this one, it makes sense that he would be more of a not so caring person and living more individualistically. But yes, I can definitely see where they would lift some ideas from Star Wars. And I mean, I do know that Max himself, more from this movie, was voted as like one of the best protagonists in a movie ever in a few lists too.
Yeah, he's a cool character. He's kind of one of those shadowy drifters that you don't know much about. Right. But he's tough and he's there to help, but at a personal gain. And will he learn something? He's more of an archetypal character than anything, I would say. But we do open with a car chase, and that kind of seems like there has to be a car chase now with every Mad Max movie, which is cool. That's fine with me. Yep. It's a good way to get me into the movie, and it's a good way to show the world and kind of like everybody's place in the world.
Right.
And I can already tell also by the set design that they're working with a bigger budget. It's a higher caliber than the last movie.
Yeah, it actually feels like a wasteland. Where the last one, the last movie they kind of played with what they had, and you can still tell the idea that they're going for, but there is also a lot there left to be desired, especially when they get into like the inner cities and stuff. It feels more like modern day, whereas now it feels like the rest of the world is like this little wasteland that they're in. Everything's kind of just desert as far as the eye can see. And so it works. You can tell that there's a much bigger budget here, not just in terms of set design, but also in terms of cinematography and what kind of explosions and destruction they will have later on in this movie. You can tell that there's a huge increase in budget just by the way that this movie looks.
Oh yeah, everything is a much higher caliber, and I would say that adds to, at least for me, the enjoyment factor of it. It feels just like a more well-rounded experience.
I would absolutely agree.
Yeah, it feels less like a student film and more like an actual theatrical film that they were able to really put some stuff into. Because, we even know for a fact that the last movie, they didn't even have permission to film in certain locations. So they're just like, let's shoot it really quick. And so, for all intents and purposes, that was George Miller's first movie. So in a way, it was very much a student film. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, this is his second film. But
I believe it is.
He's improving a lot more, I'd say.
Yeah, he definitely has an eye for stuff which we know we'll get to see later on. I'm assuming Beyond Thunderdome, but definitely in Fury Road.
Right.
We'll get to see more where his eye comes from and how he'll be able to kind of, I guess, live what he's thinking, more or less.
Now, as for the intensity of this opening scene, I still think the last movie's opening scene was better, at least intensity-wise.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I do think that at least with this opening scene, it does help get us into this is much different than what we were in 2 years ago with the original Mad Max. Things are a bit different now because now it's not really set in like a rural area. It's more set in basically the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I did find it really cheesy when the dummy fell out of the semi truck.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, gosh, that looked horrible. And also, I have to mention the blackout fades are back.
Yeah, I mean, be honest here, there is still some 80s cheese left in here. That's just a product of its time. But, yeah, that will, for a more modern audience, it'll be rather strange to see.
One thing this film, at least the story, is doing much better is getting us into the plot right away and then staying consistent with what the plot is. Whereas the first film was incredibly meandering as to who even our main protagonist was, because Max was shown in the beginning, but then it jumped to Goose for quite a bit and then back to Max, and it was really all over the place, not only with tone like we discussed, but just with what is the plot here? Who are facing off against each other, for Pete's sake? Whereas now we can clearly see that there are two major parties. Max is thrown into the middle of them, and I think honestly we could think he could go either way because he's really in it for himself.
Right. Yeah, this movie, for all intents and purposes, feels a bit more focused than the last one does, which is interesting to say because the last one, in some ways, kind of benefited from its nuttiness and how the story was told, but in most ways also kind of detracted from the story. And this one, it feels a lot more focused. Like, they kept to a central idea, which is this battle between greed and the good of humanity. It's an interesting feud between these two parties of the gang of Humongous and then this little settlement that Max is kind of in between of. Yeah, they do keep things focused, but at the same time, I do kind of enjoy the craziness from the last one, just kind of for fun's sake, because that one, although it, like we mentioned in the last podcast, the story doesn't really begin until about halfway into the movie, we think.
Yeah.
And even then, it's kind of hard to say that that's the actual story. This one, it keeps itself focused for its entire runtime and doesn't really detract or derail anywhere that it doesn't really need to go.
And I like the craziness of the world building here.
Yeah.
So if you've seen Fury Road, then you'll be right at home with the Road Warrior, because I can already tell there is so much taken from this movie and then put into the Fury Road, but just I would say we'll talk about that in that podcast, but you can just see that with each Mad Max movie is what I'm assuming Miller is developing his world and just making them better. He's like furthering his craft because he's becoming a more experienced filmmaker with how writing goes, narratively, editing, set design. You can just tell with each movie the caliber is going up. So I'm excited for that. I like that.
Yeah. I'm excited to see what Beyond the Thunderdome has to offer now that I've seen 2, which what you just mentioned is taking as some ideas that will be taken later from Fury Road. So I'm excited to see where Thunderdome lands in all of this, because I've heard some not so great things about it, but I've also heard other things that it's also very, very good. We'll get to it in a few, I think that's actually next week. No, it's a few weeks from now, but yeah. So it is also interesting too that we get this little, I guess it's kind of a MacGuffin. It's kind of hard to say. It's this music box that he finds from the dead man in the semi, and it plays Happy Birthday. But every time that Max has a hold of it, he never finishes the song that's on there. I know he gets it to the Pharaoh Kid, but I think that the Pharaoh Kid actually does finish it one time. But every time Max is around it or has it in his hand, he never finishes the Happy Birthday song. He stops like one note before the ending.
Okay, you'll have to help me out. What are they supposed to be doing with that? Because honestly, I overlooked that because it seemed to be such a non-factor in the plot.
Yeah. My guess is it has more to do with showing that Max's innocence is completely lost at this point.
Okay.
He doesn't finish the Happy Birthday song. He gives it to a kid who does finish it. It's kind of, I guess, more of a lead-in to show that he lost his innocence and that he's gonna kind of gain more back of his humanity. It's pretty cryptic. It's, I'm guessing, more of a plot device to get him to make a connection with the Pharaoh Kid when he tries to leave. There isn't too much I guess, focus on this aspect of the movie.
Okay, is that what was going on when he was leaving the compound area, the settlement, and he had all those, like, gas cans? The scene got so dark, I think the Pharaoh Kid was involved with it. That whole scene was lost on me because I couldn't even see what was going on. It was so dark. So maybe I missed it. Maybe that's why.
Yeah. Was that towards the end?
It was right. It was just like right before he was going to get the semi. He was leaving to get the semi.
Okay.
And
I do believe he gave the music box to the kid around that time.
Yeah, I missed it. It was so dark. It was so darkly shot, for at least on my screen anyway. I was watching it in my theater room and I could not make out what was going on.
Okay.
Dang it!
I had no problem seeing things.
You cranked the brightness up. I didn't. I guess I should have.
Perhaps.
Well, I guess we should also talk about, because there's a number of characters in this, and one of the more important characters, I guess, is the Gyro Captain. I just always called him Gyro.
Yeah, he isn't exactly given a name until the very end.
Yes.
Until the settlement says that he's now being claimed as the new ruler of the
Gyro Captain.
And they gave him the name of the Gyro Captain. Which, by the way, it should be noted that his gyrocopter is destroyed in this whole mess when they're trying to escape.
Yeah.
We'll get to that eventually. But yeah, he's probably one of the most important characters that's in the story. Aside from Max, because he becomes essentially his partner, especially there towards the end.
Yeah, I would say he is a fun character, not only for the comedic element, because Max is kind of keeping him as a slave for reasons unknown, I guess, so he just doesn't get double-crossed or something, so he can use his equipment later on. He does have some funny lines in there about, like, eating a snake. And I'm not letting the dog eat the snake because he trained the snake.
Yep.
So he can eat the snake. Then he uses the snake as a weapon. He drops it on people to crash their cars. But he is kind of I would say, a good companion to kind of balance out Max. Because Max is so kind of quiet and brooding, whereas this guy is much more talkative. He's an interesting character because he's so tall and his outfit's interesting because it's kind of colorful. He's like wearing long underwear and a hat or something. And he's got this interesting vehicle that they need to use to kind of not fix the plot, but, fix what's going on with the situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say he is, he's a good balance for the dynamic duo.
Yeah, he is. And it's also interesting that Max in this one is more quiet than he was in the last one. Because he was pretty quiet in the previous movie. But now we get more of that traditional Mad Max character where he is very quiet, very brooding, doesn't say too much, is always kind of thinking that you can always tell that he's thinking. But yeah, he is an interesting, I guess, contrast between this movie, is with these two characters, and the Gyro Captain being that more happier end of the spectrum when it comes to Max and his, balance between these two sides. He does have a very funny introduction where he's, buried himself in the sand, and when Max tries to steal his gasoline from his gyrocopter, he pops out and starts yelling at him because Max did see the snake and, was able to wrangle the snake before it bit him. It's a very funny opening, and he does kind of stick around with Max and does end up getting involved with this little settlement here with the gasoline, and I guess becomes their captain, which is an interesting thing for them to do because he's kind of a newcomer.
Yeah.
I would assume that since they have the smarts to rig their entire city up with flamethrowers and such, they would probably have the smarts to have I guess some kind of democracy or some kind of government-ish thing put into place, but what do I know? They don't talk about any of that.
Yeah, that element of the world building leaves something to be desired. How did they build this settlement, and how did they get all of this gasoline for themselves? Who's in charge here? Because it supposedly seems like Papagallo is in charge. There's also this weird guy dressed up like a army general or something. The warrior woman seems to have some leadership role, but she's woefully underserved. And then on the opposite side of that, we have the Humongous Crew, and he is billed as the Humongous because he has big muscles. Yep. And he has a funny voice. Clearly, they have to be imitating Arnold Schwarzenegger with some of that voice and muscles.
Yeah, I could see where they would take some inspiration off of the Schwarzenegger here, is with this character. I do kind of wish here that they would have explored some of the inner workings of this city, and how it operates and things like that. Because they do play a pretty major point. I mean, they're a pretty big MacGuffin here in this part with their gasoline. So I would have liked for them, for Mad Max here to, I guess, explain or explore the city a bit more just to kind of get an idea as to how it works and other things of that nature. Because it is an interesting little settlement that they have here in just the middle of nowhere. And that this gang keeps trying to take their gasoline away from them. I feel like it would have been, it may have went against the movie a little bit to kind of sit down and explain all the inner workings of this town when the main focus is not on that kind of stuff at all. But it would be interesting because the settlement does interest me to see, I would like to know more as to how they operate and things of that nature.
Right, and they could have done that through a bit more character building instead of just making cardboard cutout characters and propping them up. I understand we're an outsider, just like Max is an outsider, but nevertheless, we could have a couple more stronger character moments than what we get. One of the other odd choices of this movie is usually when you have a villain in a movie, one time or another, you'll cut to the villain and you'll see his or her perspective of what's going on their side, their motivations. We never get that here with Humongous, making him an incredibly one-dimensional character. And I was bummed out that this kind of weird Jason Voorhees, Arnold Schwarzenegger hybrid comes onto the scene and he's got this big crew. I don't know why. Also the same with, what is his name? Wex or something?
Wes.
Wes. Yeah. Also, with both of them, they seem to be interesting characters, but we never cut to, their camp or their point of view or anything they've done. So I was a little disappointed that we could have explored that stuff a bit more, but we don't at all.
Yeah, I totally agree with you because at least in the last Mad Max we had, it was more just in that opening scene where they're introduced, we do get to see kind of how they work and that they're there because their friend died, he was killed, and so they pursue Max because of this.
Right.
So the motivation makes sense in that movie. The motivation here, aside from we want that gasoline of yours, is pretty much non-existent. Which, I mean, does kind of play to how this world works. That may really only be their only motivation is they'd want that fuel because they want that fuel. That's the only reason why. It's a commodity in this world. But I do agree with you. I would have liked some more character building or something more with these villains that we have. I'm okay with them not really focusing too much on Humongous because, once again, just like the previous Mad Max, we're focusing more on the protege, which is Wes. Most of the time is spent more with Wes than it is with Humongous. But I would still have liked to have something more than what we're getting here, which may be a product of the times, because action movies around this era were kind of shallow, and I mean, they still kind of are to some extent, but the motivation there may only just be purposefully may have been written this way to just be, we want that gasoline. And that's really about it. And the settlement's kind of the same way. They just want to get out of there because they want to get away from all this, which I mean makes a bit more sense than the villains that are coming up against them.
Yeah, and I do also want to note there's a really nice shot. I'd probably say the best shot of the movie of the sunset, of them overlooking the valley, where I think it's at the end of, or somebody's trying to escape out of the settlement. Or, no, that's not it. I remember now. The Humongous crew is all like driving away, and they're, Max and Gyro are watching them leave. And there's a sunset shot of them overlooking the valley. Best shot of the movie. Really good.
Yes, I do remember that shot. That's a very good shot.
I do also enjoy this movie is not completely like self-serious, like when Gyro pulls out his telescope. That is super long. And Max is like, just looks at him and just like takes his away and uses that. The other thing that does get us on Max's side is that does make me feel better about him, because we're left with these kind of morally ambiguous feelings about him at the end of the last movie. I more so landed on the side that he had chosen more so vigilantism, or more so chosen revenge, which I couldn't get behind necessarily in that sense. But this sense, he seems to just go after the bad guys because, well, they're just evil. But then also he's not one of them, and he won't just drive straight into the settlement and kill people for their stuff. So I think his kind of moral direction has been clarified in this movie.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I mentioned in the last podcast, is that there is still a little bit of humanity left in him, but there isn't much. We do get more of that here, where they do show that, yes, that's true, but it's kind of still on the edge. He doesn't exactly go towards really anybody else in this movie aside from the enemy here, which is the gang of Humongous. Aside from that, yeah, he never really charges into this camp. He's never really shown to do anything outside of, I guess, kind of moving him towards being on the good side of his personality here. And part of that might just be to the way that the movie is written, where there really isn't anybody else that he comes up against. In the opening, he does kind of try to steal the guy's gasoline after he's already crashed. But aside from that, it's mostly written around him trying to help this settlement out. Whether he really wants to in the end or not, he ends up doing so. But yeah, his actions here, especially when we get towards the end and when it all finishes up, we do get to see that even though he has a lot of bad in him, or a lot of, anarchy-ish personality types in him, he still is willing to do good and help this community out, despite him really having no reason to do so, because he could just take the gasoline and run, which he does plan on doing, and actually does do until he gets into a wreck.
Mm-hmm. And then the scene where he takes the man back to safety, but it's kind of stupid, because in this world, that kind of stuff doesn't pay off. Like, they're not really going to hold up that bargain. Right. I think I found the score in that scene to work well. There's some kind of like low and high strings from what I could determine. I could be wrong. I couldn't really pinpoint it. Otherwise, I don't think that I really didn't think about the score in this movie very much. Maybe at the end there. I don't know. This was the only scene that really stood out to me that I made a note of the score.
Yeah, I would say for really all the way around, the score worked really well for me. Okay. Mostly with those more, I guess, emotional scenes where the music is a bit more dynamic. In the action scenes, I think it's fine. I think it works, but I really noticed it more in the emotional scenes that when it was going for that more bringing up an emotion. I found most of those tracks to be very, very well done.
Yes, because the score was a big factor that we talked about in the first movie. It sounded very much like Bernard Herrmann, Hitchcock's horror in certain scenes. That score, although it had many good elements, was a bit all over the place with, that's just because of the tone of the movie. One minute it would be horror, the next minute it would be 80s Bambi style stuff or something.
Yeah. And we do have the same composer coming back. Brian May returns. Once again, not from
Queen.
Was it Queen?
Yeah.
Not from Queen. Different guy.
No.
He's from a different band, I think.
So a fan theory that I have for this movie that I'm going to choose to believe is true, but it's most likely very not true. If you check out the back of Humongous's head, it looks like he might have been burned. Because he's missing hair, and why else would that happen to somebody? Why would your head look like that? My assumption is Johnny survived the explosion, decided to become a bodybuilder, and to conceal his face from the burns, he is Lord Humongous. Or, not Lord Humongous, the Humongous. Okay, that's my theory.
I could see it, because that would make a little bit of sense in the world where it's kind of, I guess, history repeating itself, where he has his own protege, which ends up being Wes, and he's also kind of the same way that Johnny was back in the first movie, and he's still kind of pursuing Max, but isn't really, I guess, eyeing him. It's more Wes in this story. I could see it, I could see where that theory could definitely work in this world here.
I mean, how great would that be for Max to just be like driving straight at him, and then Humongous rip off his mask, and he'd be like, "It's me, Johnny. Don't you remember? You left me for dead." And then just have a horrible quick zoom into Max's face with some nasty high-pitched music, kind of like they did in the first one when Max saw Goose. That would be so good, but that would be a horribly cheesy, and that would be a step in the wrong direction. But
yeah,
I don't know.
I mean, I can see where it works. I'm kind of glad that they didn't really explore his character too much, because I think in this movie sometimes the ambiguity of it all does kind of aid in setting up this world where you begin to wonder, what in the world is this? Where did he come from? And that's where it kind of gets some of its flavor, is this ambiguity, which we will find out. I'm not actually going to say that because we talked about that movie too much. But yeah, I think that some of the ambiguity is, despite there not being a lot of even setup here, I think some of the ambiguity does kind of add to that flavor of Mad Max, the Road Warrior here.
Sure. Yeah, we don't want... I've come to find out with these Mad Max movies, it's not really about the character development and the drama. It's about pursuing one goal and do it with a lot of action and explosions, and just get yourself excited about watching a fun action movie. That's what I got from it.
Right.
So Max does go and find a semi-truck from the very beginning. That is where, because he cuts a deal. He said, "I'll get you the semi-truck and in exchange for all the oil I can carry." And they're like, "Sure, we'll trust you." And I do like the juxtaposition of these characters who are very innocent and they're portrayed as being in white, and Max is not innocent and he is in black, which would seem to align him more so with the Humongous gang, who is also mostly in black. So he comes across as untrustworthy, yet still a stand-up guy, because he's willing to help out, but not without being paid in return.
Right, yeah, he's willing to help out, but not, like, follow all the way through. Because when he gets back with that semi-truck, like, "Hey, can you drive it for us?" And he goes, "No, I'm out of here." Mm-hmm. Which he does end up going back he's kind of flown back, I guess. But he does end up driving that truck in the end. But I guess his personality here is more along the lines of, I'll help you out, but I won't, I'll help you out, but I won't let it, like, right out to the end. I'll get to where I can leave and then I'm done, more or less. Once I get paid, I'm out of here.
A couple of the things I did want to mention that I couldn't help but say, like, hey, they're going to reuse that in Fury Road. I thought that was really cool. Is the flamethrowers come back and strapping people to the front of your car. They did that in this movie.
Yep. Yep, they did.
That was cool.
Both of those are used a lot in Fury Road. It is. I mean, I would love to see this movie back in 1981 being kind of fresh, because you and I both have already seen Fury Road, so some of these ideas are just kind of recycled.
Yeah.
To us, they look recycled from this movie. But it would have been super cool to see bodies strapped to the front of cars when they're driving down this desert path, going who knows how fast. Yeah,
that was cool. And also, when Max has the sawed-off shotgun and he's going to shoot Humongous with it, but it like misfires, just like when it misfired in Fury Road. And of course, the tanker is a big point. I was like, oh, that's cool. So I just found it really cool that George Miller had these ideas in the early 80s, and then he came in the mid 2010s. And he was like, hey, I kind of want to revisit these ideas, but I'm more of an experienced filmmaker. I've got a few Oscars under my belt here.
Yeah.
He's like, I think I can revamp this idea. So for that aspect, I think it's really cool to see these ideas he already had, and then he just kind of wanted to revamp them since he was better at his craft.
Yeah. I think one thing that is kind of cool that actually isn't reused in Fury Road is the two guys that they capture from the settlement and they strap them to the front of the car. They do end up dying. I want to say about halfway through, but they keep the bodies on there. In fact, they wrap them up in bags and stuff, and they remain on the car. And I think even during the chase, you get to see that car with the two bodies strapped to the front with these bodies are still there, which they don't really bring that back in Fury Road, but it is kind of a cool thing there, where that one idea that isn't brought back that I thought was actually really interesting is seeing two bodies that do end up dying remain on the car.
Something I would like to see return for the Mad Max, the Wasteland, whatever it's going to be called. I want to see somebody come back with a boomerang.
Yeah, where'd that go?
A deadly boomerang where he conks the guy in the head and it like buries into his skull. Then he chops the other guy's fingers off with it. That was a cool addition with that feral kid where he's a pretty tough kid and he's like chucking his boomerang at people.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, isn't I think Australia is known for like possibly creating the boomerang or something like that.
It's perhaps that's true. I don't know anything about the creation of the boomerang. It would be cool to see, because that's one thing that really, I guess this one and on have, as far as I know, is like these creative weapons. Here they have a boomerang that's razor sharp, which kind of reminds me of, I forget the villain, but it's a villain in one of the 007 villains that has a hat that has a sharp ring around the rim of it. And he uses it to toss it like a frisbee almost.
Oh yeah.
So
odd job.
It kind of reminds me of that kind of aspect. It would be cool to see more like these creative weapons, something like this, where it seems simple but it's actually deadly, like a boomerang here. I do know that the scene when the kid throws a boomerang and it lodges in that guy's head, they had to cut that down because they wanted to get an M rating for the MPAA, which is at the time was for general audiences. That was what it stood for. They had to cut that down, and I think one or two other scenes they had to cut them down so that way the MPA would give them that M rating. This is one of them.
Oh yeah, that is interesting. Yeah.
I do know that this movie was a lot more violent and bloodier in its original cut, but they had to cut it down for Australia because they were like, the censor board was like, and then kind of once again for the MPAA, they wanted to get a bit more money than just getting an R rating out of the gate, get an M rating where it can be more for general audiences here.
Something I can't help but laugh about, though, is the use of this gyrocopter, especially towards the end.
Yeah.
Just watching them fly around. I'm sorry, but James, you brought up James Bond with Odd Job and his deadly hat. Well, I think it's like the movie right after that, or not too long after that, James Bond uses a gyrocopter.
Oh, that's funny.
And it looks awful because there's some awful like projection screen behind him as he's flying around in it. Okay,
Nice.
for the time that would have been cool because hey, nobody's seen a little mini helicopter before. That's open air. At this point, it just, I don't know, it doesn't really work. Especially some of those shots towards the end of the camera, like just panning left to right and Gyro's just like looking down on the scene. And to me, it seems to just elongate the scene unnecessarily. But oh yeah, I couldn't help but laugh. Just like, I'm like thinking of both of these big grown men sitting there in this gyrocopter just flying across the desert.
Yeah. Now, yeah, I would agree with you. This, once again, is kind of an 80s thing, I guess. It's more there to build intensity, but at the same time, they're focusing on the gyrocopter, which, I mean, already kind of has some pretty questionable cinematography that's used with it at times. Once with him kind of reacting to things in the copter, but also when it's like, I guess it's like a point of view shot of him looking down. You can kind of see his feet and some more of the frame of the gyrocopter, but you're seeing the cars underneath. It's not, the cinematography here for the gyrocopter is not all that great, in my opinion. It works, but it's, compared to everything else here, I think this is probably the weakest point when it comes to cinematography.
One of the better scenes that I think actually gives us some real stakes and some intensity, that's not just a car chase of, oh my gosh, they could crash, but when they're coming back into the settlement and Wes gets in there. And Wes is fighting people and he's getting shot, but then other people are getting shot as well. Papagallo gets hurt. To me, that seemed like, wow, what if they actually were able to invade this settlement and then we would have some all out, street brawl here, for lack of a better term. This was an interesting point in the movie for me because it actually gave me some kind of stakes, I felt. Yeah.
And it is kind of cool here too because it kind of brings up that I guess this idea of brains versus brawn. Because here in this scene, you can tell I think it's Wes and like one other guy. Maybe there might be a third one with him. But it's only a handful of guys get in, and you can tell they can pretty easily outnumber or outfight this entire settlement here, especially Wes himself, who survives quite a long time before he eventually escapes. You get this idea of, this isn't good, because they made some pretty significant damage just with the three of them compared to everybody else there in the settlement. And there at the end, they outsmart the entire gang by putting the gas into different vehicles instead of the tanker like they had originally planned on. So they eventually outsmarted them, even though the other group was far more on the end of we know how to fight here in the wasteland.
Yeah, this is an interesting kind of retelling of what we've seen throughout history is when one group lays siege to another group in a city. And that's kind of what they're going to do here is they're like, well, we've tried to invade you. We've stolen your caravans that have been trying to escape. So now we're going to lay siege to you. And I think for more of a more modern example, The Walking Dead does this really well. So if you've seen that show, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's always some big bad that comes along and he's going to lay siege to their city or try and invade it. I also couldn't help but think of The Empire Strikes Back, where the Millennium Falcon is under repair. In this, the semi-truck needs to be under repair from Humongous shooting his funny scoped revolver at the truck.
Yep.
And, so this was really when it hit me that, George Miller watched Star Wars and Max is the Han Solo character. The truck is out of commission and he has to repair it and the Empire is going to lay siege to them on the Haas system and they have to escape. So this plot element really brought me back to Empire.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And even this action scene that comes after this scene when Max does accept the role of driving the tanker, this action scene that follows is like probably the best of the entire movie here. And it goes on. I mean, really, all the action scenes here go on for a long time.
Oh,
I think this one's definitely the longest. Like, I think it clocks in around 20 minutes, I want to say.
Yep.
Which is long for a movie like this. But it's not with that. It doesn't. I never felt like I was ever drained enough to, like, oh, we have another action scene. It was like, I'm excited to see where this is going to go, because previous action scenes that have happened up to this point have been really engaging, and this one, it's like they took a step up and they made it even more engaging than the previous, I think, 2 or 3 that have been here, and they even then that's saying quite a bit.
Yeah, I was interested in the beginning, and I was extremely impressed with how they're able to film such a big scene involving a semi-truck and all those vehicles. I imagine that would be incredibly hard to film especially without any sort of real visual effects, like digital effects, I should say, like post-production stuff at all. So for that aspect, kudos, very well done.
Oh yeah,
but like you said,
especially when they blow up the town, like that's all practical. It looks really, really good.
It does,
especially this time, and that's one of the things that really still, I would say, holds up in this movie, is especially that town explosion looks really good even by today's standards.
Something I was disappointed with is this female character. She's only known as Warrior Woman. To me, she looks interesting. She's beautiful. She has a cool outfit. I think that she could be an interesting companion to Max, and clearly they allude at maybe some possible chemistry between the two, because she's like, I had you pegged all wrong. You're actually a pretty good guy. And they kind of give each other this look. I think it'd be cool to see, a Mad Max style film with a female lead like her, and then we would get, I think Miller would rectify that situation in Fury Road by making Furiosa a strong female lead that her and Max play off extremely well. I can see there's a seed of that right here, but unfortunately they don't do anything with it, and she gets killed off, which I was bummed about.
Yeah, I would have liked, because they do kind of show that there is more than one of, I guess, these warrior women here. They do have one more, but I do believe she gets killed in one of the battles that they have before they leave. But yeah, I was thinking, are they going to build off of this character? And they kind of do. She's very much she's more of a political figure in this little settlement that they have. But aside from that, there really isn't too much that they give to her. And to be fair, there are a lot of characters here that we do have to keep track of already. But yeah, her death is something that, even though she's built up to be a very well-rounded warrior here, the fight that she has there at the very end kind of, I guess, it's almost a betrayal of the character, at least from what we've been led to believe, is when she dies, it kind of seems like she goes out with a sputter instead of going out with a bang.
And if I'm not mistaken, like, everybody who was going with Max in the tanker dies except the feral kid.
Yeah, pretty much. There's like, I think, I want to say about 4 or 5 in total on the tanker. And when they get out of it, it's just the feral kid and Max. Yeah.
Also, we do have one moment of character connections here where we're trying to get at something a little deeper, and I think it fails miserably, unfortunately. It's when Papagallo is trying to get Max to tell his story and get him to stay and say, you're not the only one who's experienced loss. We gotta, hash this out. And he just kind of gives this weird, kind of just pecking, like, what's your story, man? Huh? What's your story? And then there's this awfully cheesy punch where Max punches Papagallo. And I'm like, gosh, man, they messed this scene up. It just didn't work for me. I was disappointed, because Papagallo should be more of a mentor type figure, since he's older and clearly the leader, but he's just not.
Yeah, this is another one of those cases where they have an interesting character, but they don't really do much to explore them.
Mm-hmm.
And I did mention earlier that sometimes in this movie, the ambiguity aids in its taste. This and the Warrior Woman are not really one of those times. There's something there, and you can tell that they have history on them, and you can probably imagine the situation or their life story that the movie doesn't tell you. But it would have been nice to have a bit more to those characters, because they are interesting characters, but there is not much time given to them. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're not exactly cardboard cutouts, but in terms of, like, talking about their history and developing their character and talking about their personality, they don't really explore much of that at all, which is, I mean, it it does leave some things to be desired. It would have been nice to see that kind of stuff, albeit it may have been at the expense of derailing the movie in this, at least in this scene, or maybe previous scenes in terms of keeping us on track, which has done a really good job, I would say, pretty much for its entire runtime, it's keeping itself pretty much focused on one idea, not going nuts like the last one.
And you're right. It is possible some kind of scene of that sort could derail the pacing and drive of the movie. I know that I've spoken before. I always hate campfire character development scenes.
Oh yeah.
One of the examples I always come back to is in The Expendables 2, where they're camped out in this abandoned city for some reason, and they just all have their little character bonding scenes. I really hate those scenes because they're just incredibly forced, where it's at nighttime, they've got nothing better to do but talk and tell some sad backstory so we can, quote, care about them, unquote. So no, I don't like those because those are they're not organic at all. And They do derail from the pacing of the movie. So I don't want something like that. But if they're going to try and give us something between Max and Pappagallo, then don't have it just be goofy.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess it just kind of goes with this community all the way around there. You can tell that they have history and you can tell that there's some original material with them, but there's not much that it's really explored there aside from, we have the gas, and we got to get out of here, and we're good people. That's about as far as it goes. I mean, that's, to be fair, this movie is not necessarily going for anything all that deep. It's very much an action movie. It does have a central idea, an essential message of be careful because gas or things like it will become essentially your overlord. It'll become your master if you're not careful. But once again,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily like Citizen Kane or the deepest film you've ever seen before. It's very much an action movie.
Yes, and it is an action movie, and that's fine, but I do wish there was a bit more emotionality for me to bite onto and give a care, if that makes sense.
Right. I would have liked just some more discussion. I guess take my time. I'm going to explain who I am and things of that nature in this movie. But I do recognize that, with my own personal feelings aside, I do recognize that probably wouldn't have worked with a movie of this caliber. Maybe a little bit more explaining would have been nice, but at the same time, ambiguity does add to the tastefulness of this film, but there are moments when it doesn't work.
Yeah, and another issue here is with the ending fight. I'm questioning, where is Humongous this whole time? He comes in at the very end and cranks up the NOS, which is kind of funny. He goes shooting off.
Yep.
And they eventually just crash into each other, which I'll speak to here in just a minute. But it does cut a lot between Wes and Max, because Wes is more so the antagonist to Max than Humongous ever was. They never were. They only had one showdown and saw each other really one time, aside from the end. So I was a little disappointed because I felt like there was a conflict of who the main villain was in this movie. Because Wes gets more screen time than Humongous. It seems that way. I'm not sure if that's exactly true. But to me, it's like you gotta pick one as the real big bad and then make it that way, and then don't let the sub-villain get more time with the hero than the main villain. That just seemed a little too conflicting to me.
Right, and I would say that, although it doesn't bother me that the protege is the one who gets the most screen time and the big bad is more or less his mentor, that doesn't bother me too much. But yeah, I would agree with you here in this ending. It does kind of flip back and forth, and it tries to put Humongous in on more of a higher level, or give him more screen time, give him more of a scare factor. But everything leading up to this has shown Wes is more the big bad here, or at least the main focus of villainy, whereas Humongous is there more as support for this character, which doesn't bother me too much, but here in the ending, I do feel like we switch back and forth too often. I think that this chase, although it's really fun and everything, it is kind of hard to find who we're supposed to be focusing on, because for most of it, it's kind of just the nameless gang members from Humongous and his people. There are moments when Wes and Humongous show up, but for a lot of it, it's more just these faceless villains from Humongous' gang that we do have some setup for them, don't get me wrong, but this is nothing compared to having a villain like Wes constantly pursuing our main leads and being the one who's causing all the issues with his people behind him also following suit.
Yes, and although this chase does start intense for me, ultimately I think it kind of fizzles out a bit. I do think that where they smash into each other and Humongous is dead, that's the most satisfying death of both movies, I would say, because it's just, wow, it's huge. But I think it's because the chase goes on for 20 minutes there towards the end. And then I'm kind of wondering, okay, how is this ever going to end? There's like no sense of real urgency here because it just seems like we're just going to go on forever. And also I felt like it was kind of messed up by some of the cuts to the aerial shots and then a monotonous score for this. So although it does start off strong and end strong, for a while there, it is kind of, I'm feeling it.
Yeah, I would say for me, this whole chase didn't bother me too much, but the cuts to the gyrocopter are the things that I think could have used a little bit of work at least in this scene. They do detract a bit from the style that's on the ground because it's in the air. It's very shaky. It's not centered. I get it. It's an action scene and it's already kind of shaky just by nature. But the cinematography style from the air and the ground are very different. And there's a big dichotomy and it's a very big cut from the ground to the air. And I mean, I can see where it would work, but I don't think that it was edited in or maybe shot in the way that would have, I guess, aided to this action scene here at the end. I mean, it is important and somehow he survives that crash, but the gyrocopter is probably the biggest problem I have with this action scene here is it just it feels unfocused with this gyrocopter because it is a different style than the rest of the action scene.
Okay, so what did you think of the twist though when you find out it was just sand? And I don't think Max knew.
That's what I was wondering is if Max knew about this plan, and I got confused for a minute. I was like, okay, then how do they hide their real gas then? Yeah. And I was like, maybe they just didn't have gas at all. What if they just didn't have any? Yeah. I thought that would have been an interesting twist. Wouldn't have made much sense, but would have been an interesting twist.
I thought the same thing. I thought there was going to be this cruel twist where they ultimately weren't as good of people as Max thought they were, and they were just using him as this massive decoy just to save their own hide. So they'll drive out the back while he drives out the front to protect their oil. Come to find out, there was no oil all along. They had tricked him, and he went through all of that. Those people, it wouldn't make any sense why people were dying for it, I guess. But nevertheless, I thought that was a good twist, and you find it was placed with the people, because that was a big question that I had earlier on, was they sent out 3 vehicles and 8 people died. I thought, how in the world do they think they're all going to drive out of here and make it? Right. Now it makes sense. So that setup and payoff was worth it, I thought.
Yeah, and I think that we're kind of led to believe that this ending, the people are not as good as they came off as. Especially when they replaced their tanker with sand, which I feel like you would have been able to hear that the liquid inside the tank is not sloshing around going at those speeds, but I'll let it slide for now. Yeah, I did end up really liking this twist that it's actually with the people. The gas that belongs to them is with them, not with some stranger who is just a decoy. I did enjoy this twist that it ended up being a brains versus brawn situation, and the brains came out at the end. That seems to be a constant thing that they've referred back to here with Max and with this community that they have. Is they always end up outsmarting the enemy, not fighting them, because I mean in reality they don't have much of a chance with them in terms of combat, but with brains they absolutely do.
Now, if Max didn't know about the plan, how would they have had time to fill up that whole tanker with sand and him not just watch them pump sand out of the desert?
Yeah, my only guess is he does leave for a brief period of time, so my guess is that they pumped it in then. They don't explain that, but that's just my guess.
It's also funny because they're telling Max that they're going to go to the beach for safety.
Yep.
But then they head north. I mean, maybe there's a beach up north because they're in Australia, so I guess you could go in any of the cardinal directions and
That's fair.
make it to the beach. But for some reason, I wasn't associating the beach with the north, because I mean, who does? You think of tropics as being in the south and more so mountainous, wintry ranges as the north. It just seemed odd. Who knows?
Yeah, my guess is this is set in some random place in the world. No real point on the map, just some random desert. And my other guess is them saying we're going to go north is more of a thematic element where they're heading towards, I guess, goodness or things of that nature, which is usually in terms of cardinal scales, if you towards or forwards is more of a pursuit of the good in life or a journey or things like that. So that's my guess. They did it for more thematic reasons. Is we're going to go north of the beach, but yeah, we never do see the beach, and for all we know, the beach probably doesn't exist anywhere, or they may not have made it, but it doesn't really matter if they did or not. The point here is that Mad Max kind of gets his humanity back and does help out this tribe or this community here at the very end.
Yeah, and we get the closing monologue. We find out the narrator is the chief of the great northern tribe, who we knew as the feral boy this whole time. I don't know. Feral means that you're wild and you're just uneducated, you're like an animal. This is like an eloquent, wise sage narrating the opening and closing, and it makes
something changed for a few years, I guess.
There must be a big library preserved up in the north for this boy to be educated as such.
Yep.
That was a little surprising, but it does make sense why the story focused on the boy so much, because he was kind of a major player in this plot. And sorry, I had to clear my throat. And I was confused throughout the movie. Why do we keep cutting back to this boy? Why do we just have shots of this boy doing stuff? But it makes sense now, because it's also in a way told from his perspective. He is remembering back. This is his memories, I suppose, because this is supposed to take, like, he's supposed to be like, what? I don't know, 70, 80 years old, and he's remembering back to when he was 8. So maybe that's an excuse they can give as to why the ideology is not fleshed out, but I was surprised. Were you surprised?
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised, because I guess I didn't catch it on my initial viewing. When I looked at the summary, it says, it turns out that the feral kid was the narrator all along. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I guess I missed that in the movie. I think my biggest problem is we don't really focus on the feral kid all that much. I guess not enough for it to seem like that big of a deal that, hey, he's actually actually the narrator in this movie.
Yes.
I guess I would have liked him to play a bigger role. Cause he really does stuff here at the very end to help out, aside from one other scene. But yeah, I do think it works for the feral kid to be the one who's narrating the story, but I would have liked, once again, more from him, like with a lot of other folk in this movie.
Yeah, another movie that does this better is Legends of the Fall, where it's being recounted through their Indian... his name is Staff, I believe. Yeah, he's old. He's recounting the whole story to them. I also couldn't help but think of the movie Cloud Atlas, maybe, where old, future, but ancient Tom Hanks is like telling about the stories. I don't know. I saw that movie once in theaters, but this is nothing new, where it's kind of an old tribal tale. But I definitely agree. Give us a reason to believe this feral boy somehow transitions into a wise sage of the great leader of the northern tribe. That was just out of nowhere.
Right, yeah. I mean, once again, it works, but I wish there was more to it. My initial guess is why the kid was here was more to do with kind of a lead-in for Max to gain his humanity back. And the kid was the thing that showed him that even though he has a wild side to him, he still has some good to him, just like the feral kid does. And he still is, even though he's the kid himself is rather wild and has kind of off the hinge, there's still he still knows where his priorities lie, even though he may not even know it himself. So that's kind of what I was gathering at first. I'm sure that still applies, but yeah, it works a bit more to show that, yeah, he was the narrator the whole time.
Yes, I was going to make a joke, but it would be a spoiler to another movie we're going to review, so I'm not going to do it. You'll have to wait, listeners, to find out what I was going to say. I thought the kid was going to die here at the end, actually. I thought he was going to fall off the truck and die, and it was going to be a horrible tragedy.
So did I. And I mean, Mad Max, it wouldn't surprise me that they would go that far because they killed a kid in the first one, too.
That's right.
So for this movie, it's kind of, it doesn't really hold much back in terms of getting things to the way that they need to be for the story to work, like killing a kid or whatever. So I would not be surprised if they went that route, which I don't think they kill anybody younger than, I guess, adult age in this movie, that as far as I was able to see.
Yeah, you're right.
But yeah, I mean, I was not surprised I wouldn't have been surprised if they actually went that route, but they didn't. He survives.
The one line I did like here at the end was when the narrator says, "That was the last we ever saw of him. He lives now only in my memories." Mm-hmm. And I thought that was cool, and it was kind of a reverse shot because the first one, I believe, zooms in on him with his car, with the sunset backdrop and a cool pose, really cool shot. And then this one kind of pulls out, the memory is receding, the story is finished. I thought all of that worked well. The only thing is, I wish they would have made Max a bit more legendary. If I would have known this was the angle they were going for, as this like mythical road warrior that popped up one day and saved their village and then just disappeared into the wasteland. Yeah. I love those ideas. I just wish they would have had a bit more emphasis and impact.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Yeah, they're very much going for a savior like archetype here with Max being the one who gets them away from Humongous and the gang, gets them to where they need to go. I guess you could consider it the promised land or what have you. I wouldn't say that there are necessarily biblical ties here. I mean, you could probably pinpoint a couple of moments where they would subtly be referencing the Bible, but for the most part, it's just this man is a good man, even though he doesn't realize it, and he is the one who let us escape.
No, I can definitely see possibly, and I brought that up earlier, this is kind of like an Old Testament turf war. Yeah. It seems like where we've got these two savage-esque tribes duking it out over a piece of land or a resource that they want. But yeah, I mean, in a way, I could also see him sort of as a Moses figure, where he does lead these people out of oppression and sort of exile into more so the promised land. He never reaches the promised land. He's also a reluctant leader, kind of like that Moses figure. Regardless, it's like you're saying, more of that ancient archetype figure that they're very much drawing from and kind of putting in a post-apocalyptic world. So, like, once again, I love these ideas. I just wish we would have had a bit more oomph, a bit more meat to it. But anyways, Alan, what is your rating and recommendation for The Road Warrior Mad Max 2?
Aside from my, I guess, numerous things I don't really enjoy too much about this movie, mostly that it feels a bit. I think the main issue that I have with this is that I feel like there could have been a lot more fleshing out of characters and things of that nature, like the villain or Papagallo or what have you. Aside from those, I do really enjoy Mad Max 2: The Road Warrior. I found even its sense of production design to be really well done, with not only its explosions but also its cinematography. It has a great sense of scale and how this wasteland is way empty, is basically only sand. And I do enjoy, for the most part, aside from the moments that don't work, the ambiguity of you don't really know much about these characters. They're unique enough that you can kind of imagine a backstory to them, but it's never stated in the movie. I do really enjoy that aspect when it works. And it works for the most part for a lot of the movie. I think where it falls is more of just getting things to a point where you can reasonably create a backstory or a reason or things of that nature to apply to certain things. In the end, I still really do enjoy this movie, and I would definitely return to it, and I'd love to own it on Blu-ray now that I've seen it. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 with a pretty high recommend for me. I think that despite my criticisms, it's still a good film, in one that I can definitely see why it has left a huge legacy, especially after coming off of the first one.
Well, The Road Warrior Mad Max 2 is not much better than Mad Max. In fact, it's worse in important ways. Miller figured out how to better edit. keep a mostly consistent tone, and bring a stronger production quality. Chase sequences are mostly better, and yes, they are impressive, but most go on for too long and quickly lose their intensity. Unfortunately, The Road Warrior is a weak film. Everyone is a non-character. I understand we don't watch Mad Max movies for strong characters, but I gotta at least feel attached to someone and hate the bad guy, and I feel neither of those things in this movie. The Humongous, despite being cheesy, could have had more motivation. We never see his point of view. The warrior woman is a wasted character. Papagallo, the old teacher figure, teaches Max nothing, except we've all lost someone, so don't be selfish. Wes is just a single-minded maniac who's upset about losing his feminine slave. And even Max is more one-note than the last film. Having Max be the reluctant savior, stop some nut jobs and save some people is fine, but there's nothing solid about the story that I could cling on to or that will stick with me after this review. An example of revamping a sequel is Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead 2. Miller is beefing up the Mad Max skeleton of what will be his masterpiece Fury Road, but he's just not there yet. And I think my lack of enjoyment for the first and second film is likely due to that I'm spoiled by Fury Road. It's like reading an author's finished novel but then being asked to equally grade some of his rougher drafts. Obviously, each Mad Max film gets progressively better, except I've heard some not so good things about the next one, but I have hope for it. I just know how great Fury Road is, and comparing this one, which has the ideas but not the successful execution, is tough to wipe my mind clean when comparing, and the whole point of a retrospective is not to completely, just wipe my memories clean of that. The Road Warrior Mad Max 2 receives 5 stars out of 10 with a not recommend.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said that maybe Fury Road has ruined us for this movie. Because I'm sure that a lot of people who have only seen Fury Road and go back to see these other movies will be, I guess, put back a little bit, because Fury Road is, especially for its production value, is miles beyond these two movies. Part of that's due to age. Once again, that's just how things were back in the day, and they couldn't do as much as we can now, and technology and all kinds of stuff. For the time, it's still definitely impressive. Mad Max 2 here is, but there are still things that kind of leave it back in the 80s and not something that thrusts itself too far into the future. Which, we'll see what happens with Mad Max Fury Road in a number of years. But that just kind of seems like that's the issue here with Mad Max 2, is that it doesn't have, I guess, stuff. Its predecessor, I guess, ruins what came before it. Although it's important to know where it came from, that is still there.
Yes, I agree that I do like the fact that we are going back and watching these movies, because all of the elements that I think work so well in Fury Road, it's really cool to see those have existed all along, but they've just been honed, I would say, better and better. And I'll save my thoughts for that review as to what I think of those certain elements. But I do think that kind of at least messed it up for me seeing Fury Road first, because George Miller has, like I said, a couple Oscars under his belt. He knows more so what he's doing with storytelling, filmmaking, editing, production, even fleshing out the ideology of the Immortan Joe and Furiosa and Gas Farm and all of those things. He brings those more so creative elements to a greater degree, and even he's figured out how to bring more emotionality to that movie, whereas we're not getting that here. But it's almost like I can't completely blame him, because this is his second movie, and for a second movie, it's still extremely well done and creative in certain elements, but it's just hard. And I think it's like I said, it's like reading, okay, here's my finished book, here's like the culmination of everything I've been working on. But then it's like looking back at earlier drafts of the book, it's like, like I like what you did with the finished product, and I like what you're doing here in this draft. It just doesn't feel complete yet, because I know what the end product is, and it's Fury Road. So I think I might have said that in the last review also, is it's just tough when you're trying to like pretend like you've never seen the director's final vision before. It's almost, it's kind of like when we watched Blade Runner, the final cut, and then we went back and watched the theatrical cut, and it's like, ugh, what were you doing here?
Right.
And then it's like, well, I wasn't completely finished yet. You know, it took me another 20, 30 years to really get my final vision out there. And I feel like that's kind of the way. I don't want to completely say that because these are standalone films that are beloved by a lot of people. These movies are highly rated and considered strong cult classics. So I'm not trying to say that, but that's the best analogy I could come up with.
Yeah, and to be fair, I've seen the first Mad Max before we even did this retrospective. Mm-hmm. So I kind of already knew where this was already headed to begin with. Yeah. Whereas you had only seen about half an hour of it. Yeah. So I kind of already had the idea of, okay, well, I know what I'm getting into before we even start this podcast retrospective. Even though I've already seen Fury Road, I know where it begins. I know where Mad Max's inception came from and why it's here. Things of that nature. So I already knew what I had getting into it, which may soften my, I guess, criticisms when it comes to this kind of movie and how it ages and whatnot.
Well, listeners, thank you so much for joining us on our review of, I like saying it this way. This is just the way I want to say it. I've seen it billed this way. The Road Warrior Mad Max 2 sounds out of sequence, but I like saying it that way.
Is billed that way too? Is that like an actual title? Backwards?
Yes, I've seen it that way.
Interesting. So it's got 4 titles to it then. Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, and The Road Warrior, Mad Max 2.
Yes, so Great. The way that I say it is my favorite way. I think that's the way that I first saw it, was just titled as The Road Warrior, Mad Max 2.
Interesting.
So I've rolled with it ever since, and I'm never going to call it anything other than that. So don't comment down below and say I'm saying it wrong, because I know what I'm saying. But
it all means the same thing anyways, so.
It does. It means the exact same thing. It doesn't matter how Yoda-esque you make it. Still Mad Max 2. But listeners, once again, thank you so much for joining us. We do want to know what you thought of The Road Warrior Mad Max 2. So is this better than the first one? Is it worse? Is this your favorite? Because I know many people do consider this to be their favorite Mad Max movie of the 4. So go ahead and leave your comments down below. I'm excited and intrigued to see what you all think of this one, especially because I know that my thoughts are at odds with like almost everybody else's thoughts of this movie. But nevertheless, we love discussing movies and we love discussing them with you. So make sure that you like and share this with your friends and family. Also, if you're listening on iTunes, please give us a 5-star rating. That does help us get discovered by other people who want to have a good time listening and discussing movies as well. So we do want to grow the Silver Screen Guide community, and that's a great way to do it. And to make sure you stay up to date on all the latest posts, podcasts, videos, make sure to subscribe through either Facebook or Twitter, or even through email. Those links are all in the description below. Very easy to find and navigate. Also, if you do want to hear more from us, not just bonus podcasts, but you want to hear some movie commentaries or do some Q&As with us or hear what we think about the latest movie news and trailers, well, just for the price of a Starbucks cup of coffee, you can head on over to Patreon, sign up, and you'll get all of that great content that is yours to keep. A Starbucks cup of coffee, you drink and it's gone. This is yours. Even if you stop subscribing someday in the future, you'll still get to keep that content. So it's a really great value for your money. It does help us keep the lights on here. It helps us pay the bills for storage and bandwidth. That's not free and that's not cheap. So we do appreciate your financial support there as well for the podcast. So once again, listeners, thank you for joining us. Next week is not Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Next week is Pet Sematary, the original 80s adaptation of the Stephen King novel. Just so you all know, I finished the novel a few weeks ago, and you'll have to wait to see what I thought of the novel and how it holds up against the movie. I have seen the movie before. Have you seen it, Alan?
I have not. I've always heard of it, but I haven't never sat down to watch it. I actually haven't seen too many Stephen King movie adaptations aside from like The Shining and maybe one or two others. I guess Shawshank Redemption, but
Yes.
aside from a handful of movies, I haven't really seen many adaptations of Stephen King's novels to the big screen.
I'm excited to return to this one and see how my thoughts have changed. There's one sequence in particular I'm really looking forward to because I remember being shocked at just how kind of nightmare fuel it was. I'll be excited to see what you think because it's really unexpected when we get to that scene. It works into the plot really well though. And I'm excited to see what they do with the new movie. I'm hoping they'll do it justice, but as usual with Stephen King, his novels are usually so big and epic, they're fairly hard to stick true, unless it's Shawshank, which was adapted from a novella, or The Green Mile is one of the best adaptations of his work, I think. So I'm excited to see what they can do with it and see what Alan thinks as well.
I'm excited. I have seen the trailer for the new one. It looks pretty interesting, so I guess we'll find out what happens when it comes out. Actually, it's rather soon, I think.
Yeah, the trailer does look interesting, but some of it is not in the book, so I'm kind of intrigued to see what they're trying to go with some of that, because I'm like, that's not, what?
Yeah, I wonder how loose of an adaptation it is, or how strong of one. I guess we'll find out when the movie comes out, though.
Yeah. Well, Alan, thank you for joining me.
Sure thing.
All right, listeners, we will be back, so stay tuned next week for Pet Cemetery. Oh, I gotta go to the bathroom. I always do so bad at the end of these.